Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Easy Conversations podcast, a podcast about having easy conversations. I'm your host, Furkan Davia. In this week's episode, I'm excited to welcome Rita Bozi. Rita is a multidisciplinary somatic relational trauma-informed facilitator and psychedelic therapist, author, and podcast co-host. With 28 years experience in the healing arts, she is the director of Brilliant Healing Incorporated. She works with individuals, couples, and groups, leading unique, experiential, and creative healing retreats. She's training individuals in her 3-module program, Somatic Relational Trauma-Informed Practices for Medicine-Assisted Therapy, and was guest faculty at the Synthesis Institute. Rita is a colleague of Dr. Gabor Maté and studied his compassionate inquiry model as an advanced student while on retreat in Mexico. She was mentored by the late visionary Carol-Anne Bickerstaff and is advanced graduate of Sharon Stanley's somatic transformation method. She has a passion for attachment theory, polyvagal theory, authentic movement, Feldenkrais, craniosacral therapy, and self-responsible communication. She is a consultant facilitator of the One Brain System, a certified BodyTalk Practitioner, has a diploma in Shiatsu Therapy, and is a former instructor at Mount College in Calgary and Langara College in Vancouver. Though she is now a retired dancer and actor, she will always be a creator and performer. Her first novel, When I Was Better, is in the running for the 2022 Goethe Prize for late historical fiction. Her co-hosted podcast, Punk Therapy, Psychedelic Underground Neural Kindness, draws on her clinical work with psychedelic medicine in combination with somatic relational trauma-informed practices. She is currently working on a new book, Punk Therapy. In it, she documents the often complex yet always deeply rewarding journey of client and medicine facilitator and their parallel journeys in healing. Born to Hungarian refugees who fled during the 1956 revolution, Rita honors and remembers the long line of serfs and peasants who are her ancestors. She is devoted to the work it takes to become a kind and wise human, decolonizing the body and cultivating cherished and cooperative communities. Rita has found her private practice and creative endeavors to be mutually complementary. She brings love, commitment, and curiosity to both, inspiring others to live embodied, creative, transparent, and soulful lives. In this episode, Rita and I discuss psychedelic-assisted therapy and the benefits this form of therapy can offer. Rita and I explored the difference between the notion of drugs and medicine. We walked through the risks associated with psychedelics and how caution must be exercised with doses, the setting, environment, and ensuring there is someone who can guide an individual embarking on a journey. We also covered the spiritual aspect of psychedelics as a ritual or ceremony. Rita can be found online at brillianthealingsystems.com or on her link tree at Rita Bozi. You can also find her podcast in the show notes on Spotify. Please leave a review at the end of this episode. I would truly appreciate it. All right, Rita, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I truly appreciate you taking the time from your busy schedule and giving me the opportunity to have the conversation with you today. I'm really excited about this topic. It's something I've been exploring a lot, and I see a lot of value from a therapeutic side and both from a healing perspective too. So we'll jump into that later, but before we get started, I want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and let the listeners know a little bit about what it is that you do and who you are.
Thank you, Furkan. I'd be happy to, and I'm excited to be here. So I call myself a somatic relational trauma-informed facilitator and a psychedelic therapist. I'm an author, an educator, and also a podcaster like yourself.
Great. Yeah. So, I mean, for me, the first thing that jumps out based on your description there, what does a somatic and healing teacher or therapist, what does that entail? What is that?
So let's see if I can simplify that. We're working with the messages of the body. We're working with the autonomic nervous system. Trauma is something that gets into the body, and it gets into the autonomic nervous system, into our viscera, into our gut, into our heart, into how our brains function, how essentially all the cells of the body function. Um, the we have parts of our brains that the autonomic nervous system can be like a dictator, that as soon as something changes in the body, then every single cell in the body says, oh, this is how we're going to respond to this trauma. So working somatically is basically working with the wisdom of the body and the intelligence of the body, because the body is always trying to return to homeostasis, but sometimes we get stuck in survival states, and we get stuck in ways that we've organized our bodies since childhood in response to our caregivers, our allo parents, and our environment. So, working from the body is really the smart way to work. It's often called bottom up way, where um, we're shifting brain connectivity, where there have
Mhm,
been neural gaps or places where we've had injury to the brain, literally injury to the brain when there's ruptures in relationship.
mhm,
So we're listening to very nuanced changes in the body. We're listening for vitality. We're listening for cues of danger, because
mhm,
people are always letting us know with their eyes, with their facial expressions, with their voices, when they perceive cues of danger. So, as a somatic relational therapist, we are looking for the tiny, tiny cues in the body that there's perceptions of danger or life threats still present. You didn't notice that a lot with refugees,
mhm.
with anyone with complex post traumatic stress, is
Right.
that they'll be perceiving signs of danger when they aren't actually in the present environment, but those perceptions of danger and life threat are still living in the body. So, in a somatic session, we're helping decode the messages of the body and to clear the body of those perceptions of danger and life threat that are no longer existent, but that survival energy is still there.
Mm,
And then when we're working in a relational way, what's really important to know is that we are honoring the innate healing intelligence of the human being that we're working with, that we are not experts on them, but that we're teasing out and drawing out their agency and getting curious about their experience and how they've managed the unmanageable or
right.
managed their horror and terror, but also really getting curious, like a sincere curiosity about who this person is, with their whole culture, their society, their history, their life, and how that expresses through the body. So
Mm,
that's the trauma informed way, and
right.
noticing that nobody is, and maybe I can use this word on your podcast, no one's being an asshole, no one's being
Right.
resistant, but that even, borderline and even bipolar are very normal, or normal responses to abnormal situations, right?
Mm,
So it's that sense of nobody's trying to be anything other than what they've experienced in their environment. So that's that side of things.
right. Right. So a lot of aspect of compassion, empathy, no judgment based on what you've explained here. And obviously, to your point, a lot of that trauma does get stored in the body, and we do get the signals. And I think part of it, from my experience and talking to other people, we often need to become aware of where that is being stored. And that's kind of what you're talking about, is helping people gain that awareness so then they can know what their body is telling them.
Yeah, and and it comes through. Every single cell in the body gets the order, and it's intergenerational, multi
Mm,
generational. Like when we're dealing with our trauma, we're dealing with a collective trauma all the time, and it's not
right.
just a past trauma, but the trauma that's happening in the world now. So we're dealing with two timelines.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So based on that, the way I understand is it's often being able to understand what the trauma is telling us more from a somatic perspective. But where do psychedelics then come in? And I know you mentioned you do the psychedelic assisted therapy.
Mhm.
How are the the psychedelic experiences helping people make sense of that trauma and get a different perspective or a different understanding of what may have
Well, I'm not certain that it gives a different understanding, but it grants more access a little bit more quickly. And this can be both a positive and a negative. I want to say that because if you have very little resource in your body, if you've had very little support, then the psychedelics can open up things that you are not ready to see or handle. And this is when you get psychotic breaks.
Yeah.
This is where you get people completely dysregulated. So it's not always a good thing for that to be opened up so quickly. And this is where somatic work comes in to help get people get resourced in their body to build a little bit of somatic capacity to meet thing material that they may not have had insight to. And it's the way the ayahuasca works and some other medicines work, where it helps open up those memory centers. And we may see things that, intergenerationally that we have not seen. And that can either be very rewarding or very destabilizing.
Right.
So, yeah, it can grant access much too quickly. And people that are, sort of find psychedelic controversial, they say that it can really create a lot of damage if you're not ready for it. This is why, really taking time with our clients to get to know their bodies, get to know the way they've organized themselves, and really find out how resourced they are or not is really key to doing healthy psychedelic therapy.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess to expand on that, what are some of the things you do as a therapist in that regard to help clients prepare for if they were to do a psychedelic trip? How are you preparing them for that journey? And what are some of the things that they need to be aware of or mindful of or things they need to do in preparation?
Yeah. Well, there's quite a lot I do with clients in preparation. Um, first of all, I'll ask clients if they've have done any therapy at all in their lives and what kind of therapy, what's their level of psychoeducation. Um, I'm curious about their knowledge about trauma and how that may have played out in their lives. I'm always a little bit leery to work with anyone that says, "Hey, I've heard psychedelics is good for depression and anxiety," because normally what I'm hearing is, I just want, an end to my depression and anxiety, and it's so much more than that. So, generally, I'll work with people that have had more psychoeducation, more understanding of how their childhood trauma is affecting their present day
Right.
state and conditions. And then I seek to build a relationship with clients. So it's not just kind of like come in and do medicine work. It's we have a conversation, then we do sort of resource work through somatic meditation. I'll kind of notice how their body responds to invitations and questions and curiosity. So we spend time to get to know each other and just work together without medicine first, because you can never know what comes up in the room.
Right.
And so I just listen to how people have educated themselves and how they speak about it. And I know that there's different people with different approaches, but I'm not into throwing people into the deep end because we just never know what's going to come up. And that's a
Yeah.
little bit, we've opened up something really big with this psychedelic renaissance. And we're going to, there's going to be a lot that we're going to have to be prepared to deal with people because, we've heard of the bad trips, we've heard of that
Right.
and we know what it can do to people. And there's a lot of cleanup happening right now. So I take time to get to know people. I'm very curious about what their resources are because if they are coming from a society or a culture or a system where they're not very well supported to come out of the journey, they can get kicked right back into their old ways, right? So let's say they're living with a partner who's not supportive of their work. I need to know what their culture is that they're living in. What are they going to
Mhm.
be going back to? What kind of supports do they have? Are they working with a different therapist? Are they getting body work? What kind of practices do they have? Like this
Mhm.
needs some scaffolding. It's not just go take a medicine and your life's going to change, right?
Right.
So there needs to be some scaffolding. What other supports are there?
Mm. Yeah, and I guess that was part of my follow-up question is if people are seeking that quick fix because of what they are seeing in the media or what their friends are telling them, what is your advice to them? Because I know you mentioned you prefer working with people that have that bit of awareness and education around it. But if they're not there, are you asking them to go get that information and be a bit more prepared on their own before you can even take them on as a client?
Yeah, I mean, There's a lot of literature out there. There's a lot of really great books that we can start reading. Psychedelic Psychotherapy, edited by Tim Reed and Maria Papaspiru, is a really excellent guide to kind of get a sense of what can happen and what to look for in a guide. There's so many resources now; it's exploding out there.
Hmm.
There are a lot of websites where you can read about how to find the right practitioner. But I think it's really important for everyone to kind of put on the brakes about this idea that it's going to cure our anxiety and our depression and all these great marketing tools about what it's going to do, and that realize that we're going to have to roll up our sleeves and work. And it doesn't mean that and it's also to start small with medicines,
Right.
because sometimes people think, oh, I can have this big huge breakthrough with 5 grams of mushrooms, but they haven't had that kind of pre-support. So just to start small, and microdosing is a really great possibility for people with that, is just to start with a small little amount and see what it does and build relationship. I mean, any relationship in life requires time.
Right.
So even if you're working with ketamine, even a small amount of ketamine or a tiny bit of MDMA, I mean, all these medicines, just taking a little bit, take a little sip of it and see what
Right.
it feels like and then build up, is always wise. And, with our friends, I mean, we got to it's this sense of presence. Like, can someone actually meet us there when things get tough? Or are they going to run out of the room?
Right. Right.
And to
Right.
know that we make agreements that nobody leaves the room, and that if someone's having a hard time, you just really hold presence, or you might just create a little circle around someone. It's like inviting someone into the circle, because you hear
Hmm.
people about people running off, and they're lost somewhere.
Right. Right. And it could
Mhm.
be overwhelming too, based on what you alluded to earlier, depending on what may come up for people.
Yeah.
And if you don't have someone who's trained or doesn't know how to deal with that, they may not know how to respond and support.
Yeah,
So
I mean, essentially for Ken, whatever we haven't met in ourselves, we're not going to be able to meet in another person, and then
right.
you get some people that are just, sitting there meditating, saying how wonderful it is by the river. Well, someone else's trauma is coming up, and then they can be very dismissive and say, oh, just take it in, let it in. But it's like, well, at this point, it's a little too far for that. There's someone
Right.
who's in distress, and we need to know that we have people that are responsive to us
Hmm.
and not
Right.
discount our experience about what it should be like.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a couple of things that you touched on I wanted to also explore further. The first thing is dosage. So you obviously touched on being mindful of the dosage and how we need to slowly build that relationship. There is that aspect, in the 60s or 70s where psychedelics got a bad rep was part of the reason, at least what I've understood, is the abuse of
Mhm.
psychedelics, right? And not being able to manage the dosages. And I see that even now because access is getting easier, that
Mhm.
people may self-medicating and not totally aware of what's a safe dosage and what are some of the things you need at certain, if you do 5 grams of mushrooms, maybe you need to be paired for that and you can't just take it. So what are some things that you can share with the listeners or the audience around being mindful of dosage, especially if you're doing it by yourself?
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't I don't advocate for doing this work by yourself.
Right.
Even if you can just have someone there with you. And oh, I'm just I'm just wondering about this idea about more is better. Um, Certainly when you're dealing with psilocybin, it's always safe to just start with 1 gram, like just nothing more than that. And
Hmm.
even with MDMA, I mean, MDMA, we know how um, it's been abused as well. People can also die from overdoses of MDMA. Same with ketamine. I mean, all these places without consciousness, without bringing consciousness to it and some ceremonial setting to it, any of these medicines can be abused.
Hmm.
So, I I would really advocate right now. I mean, it's so hard because it's human nature to look for an end to suffering, to look for an end to pain. It's human
Mhm.
nature to do that.
Right.
And right now, the marketing industry is offering another end to the pain and suffering, and so it brings on that desperation. And we're going to need to find a way to get to the roots of helplessness and to attune to suffering and not just see it as a solution.
Mhm.
So I know that there's lots of, just to go to a practical place, there's lots of apps and different websites you can access online about dosing.
Mhm.
So that's really important. But I think if we think of it as um, the only way to regain connectivity, then we've got a problem on our hands.
Right. Right. Yeah, for
You
sure.
know,
And
we have to build cultures that support it. And I think we're doing that. I think we're
yep.
thinking along those lines, but we also can't rush into it because there is a gold rush on right now. It is a gold rush in terms of teaching it, offering trainings for it, signing up. Everybody wants to be a psychedelic therapist right now. It's
Yeah.
like, it takes time. It's like with anything that we do, it takes time to really understand the ins and outs of working this way and what it requires of us to hold presence, and obviously there's a lot being done around harm reduction at festivals for,
Right.
doing medicines, but like, I think it's just as important to take time away from doing medicines as it is to explore them. You need both,
Yeah.
or else it just becomes a crutch like anything else. And yes, it is expansive, expands our consciousness, but there are times where that can become too expansive and we can't integrate the learnings.
Right.
And there's other ways of coming to medicine. And I
Mhm.
always say to people when they come to my sits, I say, you are the medicine. This is just an adjunct.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in the terms of training, I mentioned to you earlier that I did another episode with a friend who talked about his ayahuasca journey in the Amazon, and he mentioned a lot of the shamans who are preparing themselves. They're often spending time with the plants and getting accustomed to them, and speaking the language and understanding them on an intimate level. And I would think in order to become trained and be able to support other people on their journey, you almost need to have a similar approach and not rush into it, as you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, some of these shamans, the shamans have been training for decades, and
Yeah.
they come from the culture of it, and they come from the community of it. It's the whole ecology of it. And so sometimes, we're getting into this there's this commercial world of the fast training, and people do a weekend workshop, and they call themselves a shaman. So it's like with it's with like anything.
Yeah.
It's a vocation that takes time. Even, if you have a child prodigy who's playing the piano at childhood, these children are practicing. They're not just
Right.
getting, coming up to the grand piano and playing Beethoven's concerto, whatever, but they practice. So it
Right.
requires real practice, and the practice of ethics is so important as well, and
Absolutely.
to renew that relationship with ourselves. Yeah,
Yeah.
we
For
have to
sure.
slow things down a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll get to that in a bit. The other thing you touched on earlier was setting, and that's something I wanted to also touch on, because setting can matter significantly. And you also alluded to music festivals, and there's that culture. And you were also talking about human nature to avoid pain, but there's human nature to also seek pleasure. And there's that pleasure seeking aspect of, I'll do a hit of mushrooms or MDMA and go to a music festival or whatnot. And that can often have certain unintended consequences that I don't think people fully appreciate. Why is setting so important when we're doing these journeys?
Yeah. So there's a lot in there, and I was just kind of decide which direction I want to take it for a moment. Um, well, there's some people that are very, very sensitive, and people that are very sensitive, they can feel overstimulated in a certain situation,
Right.
and it's that sense of like you're going out of your mind. It's too much input.
Yep.
And if you're in a setting where there's too much input, a lot of loud music, a lot of people, and you're on a bad psychedelic journey, and you can just feel like you're being terrorized. And then there's also that incredibly wonderful experience of feeling connected with everyone and you feel alive and you feel like you're full of love and connectivity and you'd like to live like this all the time, right? And it could feel like some of those most incredible experiences of your life. I had one like that, and I'm going to tie this up in a minute, but I remember spending a week. This was like back in the, oh gosh, I'm trying to remember the late 80s, and I spent a week in Ecuador, actually 3 months in Ecuador, but a week in this beautiful region,
Hmm.
this area of volcanoes, and I was with my then partner and a couple from Switzerland, where they didn't have any access to psilocybin, and we knew that this was an area in Ecuador where we could access
Right.
psilocybin. And it was, we were out in nature and there were cows and it was just beautiful. And we went there every day. We fasted every morning and we take several grams of psilocybin. And we were there in this beautiful sort of space together. It was very cathartic. You know, we saw the day changing and sometimes we saw the locals walk by. And it was a real communion with the earth, with nature, with each other. And very difficult things came up for each other, but we stuck together. And it wasn't so far removed from what our everyday could be because we were traveling in South America every day and we were in those cultures. Now it's different in a music festival where there's all that energy. There's a huge amount of energy, a lot of people. It's heightened, right?
Yeah.
And that's not our everyday. That's something that we choose to do. So when we have these extraordinary experiences and we feel like I want to be like this all the time, that's not our everyday.
Hmm.
So how do we come down from an experience where everything is love and light and great and wonderful, and all of a sudden you end up like, oh, you slept with someone you didn't realize you were going to sleep with, right? How do you come back into your everyday and integrate those experiences? So you've
Right.
got to be prepared that you're going to have a big high, and then how do you come back down
Hmm.
as you will descend eventually? What are the practices that hold us in our equilibrium?
Right.
You
Right.
know, because the crash from the high is real as well,
Hmm.
right? But this is sort of the question of how the setting, like, are we in a clinical situation? Are we in someone's studio? Like, what is the attention to the details that help you transition from a healing experience into your everyday? You
Absolutely.
know, because people do say, oh God, I'd like to feel like this all the time. But I say, hey, wouldn't that be nice? But it's not sustainable. So, how do I hold a little bit of that in my heart? And how does that change how I view my life? You know,
Right.
for example, I was in a ayahuasca experience not so long ago. It was my 23rd sit, I guess. And I was fortunately with a colleague of mine who I know very, very well. It was just my husband and I that went to this experience. And I knew that I needed not to sit with a group. I work with trauma all the time.
Hmm.
I absorb a lot from other people. And I knew very specifically that I needed not to be around other people's trauma. My husband's and mine was enough, and it was just us with the shaman, and it was very intentional, and I spent a lot of time getting ready for it, you know, the dieta. And when I came to the medicine, I knew that I was not up for a destabilizing experience because I was already dealing with some of my own post-traumatic stress, and I really had a
Hmm.
conversation with the medicine about how it wasn't about controlling it, but it was a conversation about the medicine saying, "I can't handle anything more. I need a very gentle healing experience because 'cause I'm not feeling internally safe."
Right.
So I did what I needed to do to have an experience to ask very clearly of the medicine that I needed to feel safe again because I wasn't feeling safe in the world.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so it was a very gentle experience, and it was something that I could meet, and it was an experience of shame, of how shameful I felt that I had this trauma in my body as a therapist. And I found some real presence and empathy for myself. And it was a super gentle experience. There were no visions, there were no messages. It was just me with myself. And that's
Hmm.
something that I could bring into my everyday. And it's been really integrating into my everyday ever since. I haven't
Right.
lost sight of that. And that's why sometimes less is more. And
Hmm.
it doesn't mean that we can't have ecstatic experiences, but be prepared that it's not going to be the same. Like, oh my God, I discovered that, oh, I can be this and I can be that. But then there's the hard work of how do I actually live day to day?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, along those lines, as you've touched on, especially if you're not in the right setting, we're using music festivals as an example here, but if you have some trauma come up, you're not in the right place to be able to deal with it. And that's where I
Yeah.
think a lot of unintended consequences can happen. And the other thing you touched on was the energy of the people around you. You're taking that on too. And is that the best place to be doing that? Maybe, maybe not. But those are all things you need to consider, right? And then the other thing we talked about earlier was having someone there who can perhaps support you. And if you're not in the right setting, you may not have that person who can kind of walk you through and be there as a gentle guide, help you process some of the things that are coming up, because you may not even be able to have that conversation. So there's
Yeah.
so many things, as you've alluded to factor in when you're evaluating your setting.
Yeah. And I was thinking something too is that sometimes there can be that sense of betrayal. It's like people get so open. They get
Right.
very, very open on medicines, and all of a sudden, like we're saying things to each other that we haven't said, and feel it. And people fall in love, and all of a sudden they come out of the medicine, and you're back to who you shut back down. Like sometimes people do that; they get really, really open, and then they shut right back down.
Yeah.
Right. So we need to be skilled about the transition, because then it can feel like the whole thing was not real. Right.
Mhm.
That's what that whole therapeutic process is about learning people so that, as you open back up and you're vulnerable and you say certain things, that it's going to be okay tomorrow. And I'm still going to be a human being interacting with you tomorrow. Not like, I was a sweet young um, uh, gentleman that I was working with who's, in his early 20s. And, they had this big night at a music festival and they were doing psilocybin and LSD. And all of a sudden there was like this sense of love. But the next day, the woman that he was hanging out with didn't want to have anything to do with him. Right. So there's that heartbreak that comes with being in an expanded state, very different
Right.
than therapy. And so it's just fascinating to me, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
How do
Yeah. And
you,
I think for sure, I think what we've covered here is just the abuse around it and just being aware of it and being careful, because it's not something you can take lightly. And that kind of leads into my next question around the idea that they're called drugs,
Mhm.
and wanted to get your thoughts on that because I don't believe them to be drugs, but I just wanted to get your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, MDMA is a drug, but it can be a medicine in the right situation, right?
Right.
Um, in a ceremonial situation, in a conscious situation, when we've taken time to reflect on intention, on what's being done here, then it can be a medicine. And it can flip. There's the dark side and the light side, right?
Right.
There's consciousness and unconsciousness, and anything is a drug when we're unconscious.
Right.
Cannabis is the same thing. People are going into treatment centers for their cannabis addictions, and yet it's also being used as a healing agent in the right hands and the right environment with the right intention and the right preparation. Right.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
clients will come and say, "Oh, we're doing drugs." And then we jokingly say, "Yeah, we are, but this is a medicine." And as soon, when I begin work, we always begin with a land acknowledgement. And then we work with, then we do smudge, the beautiful cleansing practice. And then we do a 7 directions prayer. So in that moment, it's starting to become a medicine. Like even the smudge is already a medicine.
Mhm.
And that's how we shift our consciousness into what is it we're actually doing here.
Right.
You
Right.
know, and we know that um, we're integrating when we're not chasing a high,
Mhm.
right? When integration isn't happening if we're still chasing a high.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So it's like really being intentional and setting that intention before you even go into it. To
Mhm.
your
Yeah.
and I appreciate you clarifying it's all context dependent too in terms of how it's being used, which can define or at least differentiate between it being a medicine or a drug.
Yeah. I mean, there's some days and I work medicinally with ketamine, but there are some moments where I might get together with my team members and we say, "Hey, let's have some fun tonight." We're always careful. Like it's never, some days we come and we work with intention and we talk about where we're at. Some days we're like, "You know what? Let's drop that tonight. Let's still smudge and we're gonna do, ketamine together and we're going into there's always reverence for it, but we might just kind of kick back and, watch the show, right?
Yeah,
But,
yeah.
but it's hard for me now, and I have to say, it's really hard for me to do recreational drugs anymore. Like, once you're in this industry and you're working with it, it's hard for me not to get into my work. So
Hmm.
it's like someone said to me, "It's ruined for you now, isn't it?" I said, "Yeah, it's ruined." It's like I'm always wanting to work on something when I do any medicine. So, I do very, very little of it unless I'm going in to really work on some issues, right? It's just
Right.
not the same for me anymore.
Hmm. Hmm.
Whether that's fortunate or unfortunate, I don't know.
Well, do you feel like it helps because you have that therapeutic side that you're able to support your own journey in a way and kind of make sense of what's coming up?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's like I knew I hadn't I had been to ayahuasca, the ceremony for about 5 years, and I knew that it was absolutely time for me to work with that medicine.
Hmm.
I'd worked with other medicines before that, iboga as well, very hard medicine. But I knew that it was time for me to go to that particular medicine because I've been working with many other medicines like 5-MeO and 3-MMC. But particularly now, I knew it was time that I needed to sit with that mother medicine and to sit with a guide as well. So, as a psychedelic therapist, you've got to do the work with medicines. There's no question because
Right.
you need to be able to sense into what your client is feeling. Because even working with ketamine, it's so different. Working with
Mm.
5-MeO DMT, it's so different. And when you have a range of experience with it, then you can know all the twists and turns of what can come up for people. You got to be prepared for that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And then I guess the other piece I wanted to cover was the whole spiritual aspect to it, right? When you think about some of the Amazon experiences people have, or even in the indigenous tribes, there is a spiritual sense to it. What's your take on that, and how is it being translated now to, where it's becoming, Alberta's made it, I guess, legal to be able to do psychedelic assisted therapy. So how's that being translated? And are we losing that sense of spiritual essence that was there before?
Well, I want to say that psychology really divorced spirituality and long ago. And I think that
Yeah.
psychology is starting to realize that working with any human being, there's a spirit in front of you. And when we are in trauma, we're dealing with spiritual trauma. We're dealing with the brokenness of someone's spirit or, trauma of the soul that we
Right. Right.
cannot in any kind of a situation. We cannot divorce the body and the soul and the spirit and the mental and the psychological. They're all in it together. So it's always spiritual. It's always beholding the spirit of another human being at any time, you know.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think we're starting to think more holistically now.
y-
And, I remember an amazing quote in Gabor Mate's book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. And he, if you've read the book, he was talking about, addicts and just horrendous environments in the downtown east side of Vancouver. And one of the addicts said that he was like sort of at the his last legs of his life. And he goes, "What was it that got me out of the gutter?" And he said, "It was my spirit."
mm,
In that moment where he wanted to OD, and he said it was his spirit that lifted him up out of the gutter, and then he changed his life. So that can help in with or without a psychedelic experience. It's like there's some part of your spirit that says, "I'm not ready to go." And so, and I want to say too that it's very different for everybody who and how you're going to have a spiritual experience. Some people are swore by psilocybin as their spiritual experience. I have nothing but shit come up. I'm just like heavy, dark. Like, it's horrible for me with psilocybin. I get my spiritual experiences from ketamine. That's where I like attune. That's when I'm like feeling into historical spirituality, a sense of oneness. That's where I find it. And I get that with, ayahuasca, and it's very different for people. So I think it's really important that it isn't one size fits all, that this is the medicine for that. And that we discover with each client or each person, which is that medicine that grants you that kind of access.
for sure.
And there's not something wrong with us because we're not having a spiritual experience. I hear this all the time with psilocybin. I still want to know about it because I don't get it. I had
Yeah.
it back in Ecuador decades ago, but it's not the same for me now. I get into the dark stuff with that medicine. And so it's just very interesting how we all have a different
Yeah.
chemistry and um, yeah.
Yeah. Do you feel like some of these medicines are meant to get you to a certain place and similar to your experience with ketamine, like, and then after a while it served its purpose?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
After a while,
Definitely.
I had a long sort of relationship with 5-MeO. I did a lot of work with it over COVID because I had the time to, and I sat with it a lot, and I got deeper and deeper into uncovering things. And then one night, I had a very terrifying experience with it. It felt like a near psychotic break, and I knew I had pushed the limit with it. And it wasn't.
Mm,
I wasn't taking more of it. I was taking less and less and less, but I was getting more and more and more open.
mm,
And I had to slam on the brakes because I uncovered some trauma there that I didn't know was there. And fortunately, I had my team in the room, but I actually had to tell everyone to just back away. I had to, through my body, move through this. Um, and it's really humbled me. Like, oh my goodness, it's humbled me. I have not been able to touch that medicine ever since. And I know someone would say, oh, do a little bit more, but I have just this inner knowing that like that was my limit there
right.
and I need to pause and I'll be back one day, but I needed to go to a different medicine for support. And that's why I had that very gentle and kind holding from Mother Ayahuasca, which she says, okay, sweetheart, you worked really hard here. Let's take a break. And
Yeah.
it's not
Yeah.
time for you to feel safe because I got very, very intent on clearing trauma from my body, but it was more than I could handle. And when you bring
Yeah.
things out of association, it doesn't mean you're resourced enough to process it.
Yeah. And that's such an important point to note because you have to almost take the message the medicine is giving you too, that maybe
Yeah.
it's time to back off and not pushing it. And even
That's right.
someone with your experience and therapeutic background too, to be able to have that type of experience and acknowledge it, right? So it's important for people to be aware of that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. We have this tendency, and I think it's the colonial mind and the dominant mind that wants to dominate issues. And we have to actually take a look at how colonialism and the dominant culture has gotten into everything, this sense of more and stronger and cut through and jackhammer and, get in there, where in fact we have to take a much more gentle, maybe more feminine approach, a more
Mm,
indigenous approach where we let things come in their time. It's cyclical time. It's not about just getting in there and getting at the trauma, right? So we have to circle around it in a more gentle way. So I've
right,
been sort of decolonializing my own process because my whole background was about dominating the body or dominating my issues or trying
right.
to get in there with aggressive force. And I don't do that anymore. So, and I think my clients kind of know that too, that we go in a softer way and meet in a precise way what's emergent,
Right.
right?
Yeah. And do you feel that forced approach is happening right now in terms of how the the access to psychedelics is becoming more easy for people and this whole push that we're seeing? Do you feel that's a bit of a forced approach or is it fairly natural?
Well, I think it was already the dominant culture that cut off the access.
Yeah.
So that was like already that's a problem. Right?
Right. The way it's
Go
being
back.
brought back in, right, into our
Mm,
culture again and the access people have to it, right? That's what concerns me
yeah,
is everything
exactly.
we've touched on thus far, knowing that how responsible you have to be with these medicines. And then you've got this culture here that's made it very accessible, even though it's not fully legalized in certain parts, but it's easy to get these things.
Well, I think that they were always easy to get on some level. I never had any problems getting it personally.
Well, you just need to carry your contacts then. No.
But it's just incredible these repressive ideas and really stemming from, I mean, it goes so far back, and I wouldn't be representing the history of it well enough, but it goes back so far. I mean, we already know how long there are these ideas that psilocybin-formed consciousness. Like this has been going on for thousands and thousands of years. And
Right.
then I kind of wonder, did someone have a really bad trip and then they shut it down, or someone went and did it on their own and then they got into power and shut it down? It's just, we have a lot of misconceptions about access, where there have been tribes and indigenous cultures that have been working with these medicines for so long, right? And of course, anytime you create a lockdown, there's going to be offshoots and there's going to be
Right.
underground, there's going to be abuse, right? Because then there's like this assumed authority that's telling you what you can do and you can't do, right? So there's always going to be an underground,
Of
right?
course.
Um, but yeah, I guess it makes me sad to think that some people are waiting for access for it to be legal, that they're still looking to these assumed authorities to tell them what they can work with or not work with, to tell them whether it's safe or not. So, and that's what dominant culture does, is it takes away that agency and that self-knowing and that intuitive wisdom that we all need to get back to.
Right. Right. And do you feel there's an aspect of fear behind that because of what we hear, what we're told?
Yeah, I do think there's an aspect of fear behind it. I mean, I even say, hey, be careful.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think that, when we have governments telling us what we can and can't do, then it creates a child consciousness in the culture, and we all need to be treated as adults that are consenting adults, and create communities of support. That's the big piece here, is having communities of support, and that fosters agency. That fosters agency.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I agree for sure.
Yeah. Mhm.
Rita, that's all I had for questions. I don't know if I covered everything, but if there's anything you feel like that's really pertinent and the listeners can gain value from, please feel free to share if we missed anything in this discussion.
Yeah, it's been very rich. Thank you for Ken. Maybe the one thing I would say is that I think we have to be very careful about who the gatekeepers are, who we think are controlling this and get the last say on it, and
Yeah.
that there are many ways that people can go out there. It's not just, and with all due respect to doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists, and counselors, and nurses, and I think that there are going to be a lot of lay people in the world that are going to be doing beautiful space holding, that already are doing beautiful space holding,
Mhm.
and that we have to trust that it's going to be a community effort,
Yeah.
a global
Absolutely.
community effort.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're seeing a bit of that too, right? I mean,
I
that's
am.
for sure.
Yeah.
And that's how I was able to meet you. So
Well, yeah, and I really like to, in terms of the people that I train, I like to work with people that have life experience. They've done a lot of personal hard work and they got a lot of heart.
yeah.
You know. Yeah.
Well, Rita, thank you again for doing this. Thank you for sharing all your wisdom and experience. I learned a lot myself. I hope the listeners do too. And again, I appreciate you coming on here and giving me the opportunity for the
And
conversation.
thank you so much for having me. I it's always such a beautiful place to be asked, and whatever I can share that might benefit someone, I'm always so delighted.
Yeah, absolutely. I do give guests an opportunity to share ways of being contacted. I'll leave that to you if you want to. But yeah, if there's any way people can get a hold of you that you want to share.
Yeah, you can check out my website, Brilliant Healing Systems, or check out my podcast, which is called Punk Therapy.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Rita.
Thank you so much. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you for checking out this episode with Rita. As always, please leave a review or a comment in the comment section. I always love hearing from you. And until next week.